One of the things that occurred while we were in Europe was an election that took place in England during that time. It occurred when we were actually in Belgium, and the results came through, and we crossed over to England the day after the election. Very interesting to get the perspective of many of the brethren there, as well as to just see some of the things that were going on and the responses that were taking place. Because one of the things that really hits you in going over there is the awareness that Europe is very definitely coming together as one nation. When we traveled from Belgium down into Germany, and then Germany across into France, and France back up into Belgium. It was no different than going from Louisiana to Texas or over to Mississippi. There was no stopping at the border. There was no passport check. There was nothing. You could see the buildings where they used to stop you. It used to be the border checks, but it was very simple. You just kept driving along. The only way you knew you'd gone from one country to the other was there was a sign up, welcome to France or whatever it was. Just about like driving from Louisiana into Texas. Now, interestingly, when we went from France into Britain, of course, is supposed to be a member of the European Union as well. It was a totally different story. You went through all the passport checks and all the stops and all the hassle that you normally would going from one country into a foreign country. In fact, it was more getting from France into England than even when my wife and I have driven up, to visit her family in Canada, going from the United States into Canada. That's simpler. You had to show paperwork and documentation, and it was a big matter getting into there. So it strikes you as to what is happening, the unification that is coming about, and yet Britain has been dragging its feet because Britain has been sort of ambivalent. They've been two different directions on the whole integration of Europe together. And what is clearly happening, Chancellor Cole, and I don't think I had fully appreciated the fact until being over there, the extent to which Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, is really the driving force behind the European Union. He is announced for re-election in Germany and has stated that the reason he wants back in office is that he needs 2 more years to ensure that Europe is so much welded together in terms of their economy, in terms of all the factors, that it is so that the nations are so intertwined in their affairs that they will never, ever be able to effectively separate, and that the progress toward a federal union of Europe is to be irreversible. And this is his goal and his plan, and he's was very plain about that. And this was widely reported. It was interesting to see the telecasts, the news telecasts over there, and to read the newspapers and to see the kinds of things that were being quoted. And right in the aftermath of the election, the new political party that has come to power in Britain after a period of 18 years is the new sort of inexperienced leadership, very much in awe of Chancellor Kohl. In fact, it was interesting that the leadership of the European community made no secret that they were openly celebrating the election of the new government in Europe, or in England. This was much more to their liking. The Germans were very happy about it, and the new prime minister was just sort of eating out of their hand. He was going to go over there and find out what he needed to do. Well, I'm going to read you about that in the book of Hosea, because I think it's important for us to understand some of the things that are shaping up, and the fact that that these events were prophesied in the pages of the Bible, and that we are in a time period when the stage of the world scene is being rearranged. If you go to see a play and there are several acts, the curtain rings down between acts. And when the curtain is down, there is a rearranging of stage furniture that goes on the stage. And you don't see what is transpiring because the curtain is down. But when the curtain rises, there is a totally different scene that is set up. And it's time for a new act. And there's a totally different arrangement on the stage. We are in that period when the curtain is down and the furniture is being rearranged. And the time is going to come when the curtain is going to rise for the final time. And the final act, the final scenario that the Bible foretells, the events that are going to culminate in the return of Jesus Christ to this earth and the establishment of the kingdom of God, are going to occur. And we are living in the days that are on the threshold of that. As these things begin to move forward, begin to shape up, and it was very interesting to see sort of the perspective right there, some of the things that are happening, that are taking place. As I mentioned, the role of Chancellor Cole was very apparent, being there in Europe and the things that are very openly talked about and proclaimed in the news, television programs, as well as on in the newspapers and just among the brethren there who are talking and who are familiar with these things. In fact, they had even saved us. One Mr. Devine, who's our elder there in Derby, had actually videotaped some footage off of a program on television that he showed us Saturday night that really to just sort of give us a flavor of what really is happening and what is being said and what is occurring. You know, there were some events that occurred a number of years ago over in Europe, and at the time that they occurred, I knew from a biblical standpoint, from a prophetic standpoint, that this ought to be a time of significance, and this event occurred. And for a long time, I sort of puzzled as to why this particular event was so significant. I think after this trip, I understand far more fully. I don't want to get into the details of it. I've covered some things on it before in sermons and Bible studies. But there are two different references in the book of Daniel that highlight a particular date. Two different prophecies. There's a prophecy in Daniel where Daniel pictures pictures Babylon as being like a great tree. The Babylonian Empire as being like a great tree. And in this vision that he had, the tree was cut down. And the stump was banded with iron. You can read this back in Daniel chapter 6. Let's see. No, go back a little further here, and in Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4 is the account that I'm making reference to. But the tree was cut down and the stump was banded with iron. And in Daniel's vision, what he was told was that 7 times would pass over. 7 times would elapse. And at the end of that time, the iron bands are clipped and the stump begins to give new growth, and something new begins to come up from the roots. And in a very direct sense, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of the Babylonian Empire, went insane, and he was gone for a period of 7 years, 7 literal times, and then came back to his kingdom. But there was a lesson there, a lesson that Nebuchadnezzar's successors did not learn. Now, 7 times in the prophetic sense, 7 times is 2,520 days. Now, you can figure that out through several places in the Bible. The expression time, times, and half a time is equated with 42 months, or 1,260 days. You can read that in Revelation 11, Revelation 12. Those expressions are used. There are other places as well. These expressions are used. Well, 42 months is 3.5 years, 36 months plus 6 more. 1,260 days is 42 30-day months. 1,260 days times and a half a time, 3.5 years. 7 times is twice that. That's double 3.5. Double 1,260 days. Therefore, it's 2,520 prophetic days that were to pass over Babylon from the time. When was the tree cut down? Well, that was the fall of Babylon. That occurred on the evening of the Feast of Trumpets in 539 BC. That event is described in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel 4 tells the story of the tree, and Daniel 5 introduces the fall of Babylon and the events that occurred that evening. And interestingly enough, that evening, Belshazzar saw what? He saw the handwriting on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Now, again, as you go through that, you find that the mina, the shekel, the phares were units of weight. They were units of weight. The question, these weren't just nonsense words. People knew these were weights, these were measures. What they didn't realize was what was the significance of that. It's like if you saw written up on the wall, pounds, tons, and ounces. What would that mean? Well, that was the equivalent of what they saw. They understood that these words were measurements, but it seemed meaningless. Daniel went through and he explained to them that they were weighed, and the significance was that Babylon was weighed in the balances found wanting and was going to be divided. And interestingly enough, when you take those measurements, and if you're added up, if you try to add feet and inches and yards, what do you have to do? We have to break the measurement down to the smallest measurement, in order to get it up. If you had, 4 feet, or 4 yards, 6 feet, or 2 feet and 11 inches, how would you add that up? Well, you break it all down to inches and you add up. Well, interestingly enough, if you take the mina, the shekel, which is mentioned twice, meaning, or the mina, which is mentioned twice, meaning, tekel, or shekel, upharsin, the u just means and. You add up those, interestingly enough, it comes out to 2,520 when you break the measurements down. So right here in Daniel 4 and Daniel 5, you have this figure that equates to the 7 times that was to pass over Babylon from the time of the fall of Babylon, when the tree of Babylon was cut down. But you see, that wasn't the end of Babylon, was it? The stump was banded, and eventually it would come to life once again. I remember very vividly about that. In fact, I remember preaching a sermon on it on the Feast of Trumpets in 1982 in Houston, because that was and given Bible studies on it before. But if you come forward 2,520 years from the fall of Babylon, from the Feast of Trumpets, 539, that brings you out to the Feast of Trumpets in 1982. And, I was sort of curious what's going to occur, what's going to happen. Many times when events of significance happen, you don't fully see the significance at the time. I remember a number of years ago, one of the newspapers published, they had an article, I think it was must have been, in fact, I think it was in 1979, because it was around the time, it was the time of the 50th anniversary of the great stock market crash of 1929. And they republished the front page of that newspaper from the morning after the stock market crash in 1929. Now, we look back historically and we recognize that the great crash of 29 precipitated the Great Depression, and was a tremendously significant event that affected the lives of untold millions. But the headlines of the newspaper the day after the stock market crash was not, "Stock market crashes, Great Depression begins." In fact, it was very interesting. What they'd done, they interviewed the Secretary of the Treasury, and he explained to them that this was just a little course correction in the market. Really didn't amount to anything, and everything would be back normal, and the economy was sound. He gave them all the reasons as to why this really wasn't serious. Now, historically, we look back on it and we say, well, he certainly missed the point on that, didn't he? That was the beginning of the Great Depression, and it's dated to that event. But, people at the time did not recognize, most people did not recognize how significant that particular day was and what happened. The evening that began the Feast of Trumpets in 1982 saw an event of note happen in Germany. Germany had been governed for several years by a coalition of 2 political parties, the Free Democrats and the Social Democrats, and they governed Germany together. And the Christian Democrats, which is the official Roman Catholic political party in Germany, was the opposition. We think in terms of division of church and state over here, but that is not the way it's viewed in Europe. In fact, in most of the nations, in Spain and Germany and Italy, there is a political party, the Christian Democrats, which is the official Roman Catholic political party. The Vatican funded these parties in the aftermath of World War II, and they are the official Catholic political parties, and have been, and they're equivalents to those in most of the European countries, particularly those with significant Catholic populations. So the Christian Democrats had been on the outs for a period of years. On the evening of the Feast of Trumpets in 1982, there was a startling announcement that was made from Bonn, and that was the fact that the Free Democrats had withdrawn from the governing coalition. This provoked a collapse of the German government, and 2 weeks later, on the evening that began the Feast of Tabernacles in 1982, Helmut Kohl was sworn in as Chancellor, and the Christian Democrats came to power. Chancellor Kohl has been the Chancellor ever since in Germany. Now, he has played a very key role both in the unification of Germany and the events that took place in Eastern Europe, which interestingly occurred 7 years after his coming to power, exactly that fall of 1989, exactly 7 literal times that had gone by. And in the aftermath of that, one of the things that I realized in this trip was the extent to which he has been very much the moving force toward bringing what was, at the time he came to power, it was the common market. Remember, that's all Europe was. They were just a common market. It was a trade zone. It's not the common market anymore. It's the European Union. They have not only undergone a name change, they have undergone a difference in direction. And now the issue is Britain going to, how far are they going to go in this regard? Most of the people there don't realize fully what is happening in the direction that it's going. Now, it's interesting. The book of Hosea in the Scriptures is a book that is directly addressed to Ephraim, the ancient forebearers of the modern British people. I think most of us have read and studied the books and booklets on the identity of Israel in the United States and Britain and prophecy. The book, of course, Mr. Armstrong wrote years ago, Mr. Raymond McNair's booklet that we have published in recent years. Now, here the book of Hosea is directly addressed to Ephraim. And there are a number of things that I think I want to just call our attention to a few things here that sort of connect with what is happening over there right now. Hosea chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Hear the word of the Eternal, you children of Israel. For the Eternal has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there's no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break out and blood touches blood. One thing leads to another." Now, much of the prophecies are directed in a general sense to Israel, the United States and Britain together, and then in several cases Ephraim is specifically singled out. God comes on down in verse 6 of chapter 4, and he says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I will also reject you, that you shall be no priest to me, seeing you have forgotten the law of your God. I will also forget your children. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore will I change their glory to shame." God says the more our people have been increased, the more we have grown, the more we have prospered. We have sinned against Him. And the more that our nations, going back to the time in the early 1800s as Britain and America began to rise to their ascendancy, the more that we have received in a material sense, the further away from God and His law and His revelation that has been the case. He says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Not a lack of technical knowledge, but a lack of the knowledge of God. Well, it comes on down in chapter 5. In verse 5, it says, "The pride of Israel does testify to his face. Therefore shall Israel and Ephraim fall in their iniquity. Judah also shall fall with them." Now, I went through a sermon going through some matters relating to the Middle Eastern prophecy and the role of Judah back several weeks ago. Here we're told the time is coming when Ephraim is going to fall and Judah will fall with them. Verse 7, "They have dealt treacherously against the Eternal. They've begotten strange children. Now shall a month devour them with their portions." Now that's sort of an obscure statement. A month shall devour them with their portions. Well, you know, when we look at several things, you might just turn back in the book of Daniel to Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 7. Daniel is seeing this vision, and he asks, "How long will it be to the end of these wonders?" in verse 6. Verse 7, "I heard a man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up in his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and he swore by him that lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished." So, times and a half. Now, you can go back to, as I mentioned, Revelation 11 and 12, and you find these phrases equated with one another. Revelation 11, it talks about, in verse 3, the two witnesses prophesying for 1,260 days. And on down a little bit further, it comes on in chapter 12. Oh, let's see. Well, up in Revelation 11, verse 2, it talks about the Gentiles treading down the court of the temple for 42 months. This is Revelation 11:2. And in verse 3, it talks about the two witnesses prophesying for 1,260 days. Well, 42 months. 42 times 30. 42 30-day months is how many days? 1,260. So you find those phrases equated coming on down in Revelation 12. It talks about the woman fleeing into the wilderness in Revelation 12:6, being protected 1,260 days. And then coming on down again right here in this same chapter, and it talks about the woman, verse 14, being nourished for times and half a time. So 1,260 days, 42 months, that's 3.5 years. That's what times and a half a time means. Here in Daniel chapter 12, we read this times and a half time, 1,260 days, the time when the people are scattered, the nations of Israel are in captivity. Then Daniel was told in verse 9 to close up and seal the book till the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white, and tried. The wicked shall do wickedly. None of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. Verse 11, from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Verse 13, but go your way till the end be. You shall rest. Daniel was going to die. He was going to rest. He was going to sleep in the grave. And you will stand in your lot. That's when Daniel will be resurrected. He will stand in his lot, in his portion, at the end of the days. Now, we've just gotten through reading about these various days. They're different lengths, but they're all going to end at the same event. They're going to end at the time when Daniel will stand in his lot, at the time of the return of Jesus Christ, the time of the resurrection. Now, where are we going with this? Well, notice there's an event that precipitates many of these things that's spelled out. It's a time when the daily sacrifice will be stopped and an abomination set up. And that will begin a countdown of 1,290 days. And yet we were told earlier that Israel would be in their captivity for 1,260 days. What's the difference between 1,290 and 1,260? 30 days, right? Isn't that what Hosea 5:7 says? Now shall a month devour them with their portions? That's the month. That's the 30 days. The time that will begin, the events that will begin when the abomination is set up, and the daily sacrifices cease, and that period, that month, that 30-day period that will see the destruction and the devouring of modern Israel. The nations of Israel, Ephraim, Manasseh, as well as Judah, because we saw that Ephraim will fall, and Judah shall fall with them. It brings out in verse 13, when Ephraim saw his sickness, and Judah saw his wound, then went Ephraim to the Assyrians. See, Britain went to join the common market, hat in hand to Germany, way back when they saw their economic problems, their economic sickness. Well, as we come on down a little further here in the book of Hosea, let me just show you. Hosea 7, verse 8. Ephraim has mixed himself among the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. Strangers have devoured his strength. He knows it not. Yea, gray hairs are here and there upon him, yet he knows not. The pride of Israel testifies unto his face. They do not return to the eternal their God, nor seek him for all this. Ephraim is also like a silly dove without heart. They call to Egypt. They go to Assyria. Assyria, the ancient ancestors of the German people. And That was one of the interesting things about seeing there and visiting in the city of Trier, the place that represented that was the original Assyrian colony that was established there, from whence the modern state of Germany ultimately developed, established right after the time of the Tower of Babel. Well, we read here that they're going to go to Assyria. Well, coming on back in a little further down, Hosea chapter 8, verse 7. They've sown the wind, and they'll reap the whirlwind. It has no stalk, the bud shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, the stranger shall swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up now. Now shall they be among the Gentiles as a vessel wherein is no pleasure. They're gone up to Assyria, a wild ass alone by himself. Ephraim has hired lovers. They have sought allies, and they've sought to entangle and entwine themselves in the scheme that is arising in Europe. They've continually gone to the Germans, and now the new Prime Minister Blair has gone hat in hand to Chancellor Cole to find out what he needs to do to be a part of what is shaping up. Well, as we come on down in chapter 9, it talks about some of these things, and in verse 11 it says, "As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird from the birth, and from the womb, from the conception." Continuing on in chapter 10, Israel is an empty vine, verse 1. Talks about in verse 5, the latter part of the verse, the glory thereof, because it is departed from it. He shall also carry unto Assyria for a present to the king. Talking about, again, Ephraim going to Assyria, seeking their assistance. Ephraim shall receive shame. Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. They're going to get themselves in a mess. Ephraim, verse 11, is like a heifer that is taught and loves to tread out the corn. And God says, verse 13, they've plowed wickedness and reaped iniquity. All over and over. You come on down through chapter 11, verse 5. He shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refuse to return to God. So God goes on and he talks about that chapter 12, verse 1. Ephraim feeds on wind and follows after the east wind. He daily increases lies and desolations, and they do make a covenant with the Assyrians, enter into a league, enter into an agreement with the Assyrians, and oil is carried into Egypt, or carried through Egypt. But the Lord has a controversy with Judah, and he'll punish Jacob according to his ways. According to his doings will he recompense them. So we come on down over and over, and it describes these events. And Israel, the message in chapter 14, or in chapter 13, verse 9, it says, "O Israel, you have destroyed yourself, but in me is your help." Chapter 14, verse 1, "Israel, return unto the Lord your God, for you've fallen in your iniquity. Take with you words and turn to the Lord. Say unto him, take away all iniquity and receive us graciously. So will we render the calves of our lips. Asher shall not save us." Assyria, they're going to have to realize Assyria is not the solution. "We'll ride upon horses, neither shall we say any more to the work of our hands, you are our gods." So the time is going to come when repentance will come about. But the state of things that is described right here is the state that is shaping up. We stand at events that the Scriptures have prophesied of for all these centuries, events that are shaping up and coming together. At the end of World War II, when Germany lay desolate, the British Empire was at a pinnacle in terms of power, in terms of scope on the world scene. The United States and Britain stood victorious. Anyone who would have suggested at that time in 1945, as the cities of Germany were being pummeled into destruction in the closing days of World War II. Anybody who would have suggested that in the lifetime of the people who had fought and won World War II, Germany would be the nation that would dominate Europe, the British Empire would be totally gone, and Britain would be going hand hat in hand, to the Assyrians, to the Germans, to help us, to bail us out, to let us join with you and let us enter into a union with you. You'll dominate, you'll rule. You know, it's very interesting that the things that are being openly promulgated from Germany right now in terms of the goals of the federal Europe, many of them come word for word out of statements that you can read that were issued back in the 1930s, 1938, 1939, as Hitler described his dreams and his goals for a union of Europe. Very interesting. And yet, like calves to the slaughter, they do not recognize what's happening. Well, brethren, we're living in the days where these things are shaping up, events that would have seemed so far-fetched just a few decades ago. Events that would seem far-fetched in the lifetimes of many of us right here. And yet these things are increasingly becoming reality. We are living on the verge of the culmination of all of the prophecies of this book. Events that are going to culminate in the return of Jesus Christ in power and glory. Now, we've got to go through the time between now and then. And how are we going to do it? You know, we can read these scriptures and we can read about these prophecies and we see these things shaping up. We see these things coming together. And it's all well and good to know and to understand what's happening and to see these things shaping and arising on the world scene. But what are we going to do? How do we live through these times and through the tumultuous times that lie ahead? There's only one way. It's pointed out in the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk, let's notice in chapter 2. Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 2. The Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and shall not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. There is reality. What God has said is going to come to pass. Verse 4, behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. The just shall live by faith. Actually, his faith is the faith of Christ in us. You know, Paul explains that I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul explains that back in Galatians. So the just shall live by his faith, by the faith of Christ in us. We're to live by faith, we're to walk by faith. That's the only way we're going to get through the events that stretch out ahead of us. We're going to have to really know God. We're going to have to walk in faith. We're going to have to live by faith. You know, God's not real to most people. God seems very far off, very remote. And that is the case in the world around us, and we live in a world that is geared against faith. And Satan is on an all-out assault against faith among the people of God. He would like for us to have our lives run and dominated by fear, by suspicion, by all sorts of things that take us away from faith. Faith is a very simple, childlike quality, and sometimes faith flies in the face of what you see. There's an interesting account given in the book of Isaiah, chapter 36. The book of Isaiah is a book of prophecy, and yet here is a historical inset, several chapters right here in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 36, verse 1. It came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came up against all the defense cities of Judah and took them. Now the Assyrians had come in, and they had conquered northern Israel and deported the people of northern Israel. A short time later, they came on further south, and now we find Sennacherib has come up into Judah, and very quickly he overran the whole country. And he's taken all of the defense cities. They've all fallen under his sway, and now here in verse 2 of chapter 36, the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh, who was his general. He sent him from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army. So he came here to Jerusalem, to the capital, where Hezekiah was, surrounded the city. Now, you know, if you're going to look at it from a human standpoint, this is looking pretty bad. The Assyrians have come in and they conquered northern Israel, took them into captivity, gradually depopulated the land, deported the people over a period of several decades. Shortly after they came into northern Israel, now they've come on down to Judah. And they swallowed up the whole country very quickly. They've now come with a massive army and they have surrounded Jerusalem. Now you look at that and say, that looks pretty bad. And they sent word to the Jews, verse 4 of Isaiah 36. Rabshakeh said unto them, say you now to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what confidence is this wherein you trust? What's the idea of trying to hold out against me? What can you do? What confidence do you have? He says, if you're going to depend on the Egyptians, verse 6, that's not going to work. They won't be able to help you. If you're going to tell me that you trust in your God, verse 7, He won't be able to help you either. Why, Hezekiah has torn down altars to God all over. Well, yes, they were the wrong kind of altars. They were the high places that had been built through Judah. Hezekiah had torn them down. That wasn't the way God wanted to be worshipped. But you know the way the Assyrians looked at it? They said, well, you know, those were altars to your God. And you've torn those down. Why, you're not going to be able to do it. We want you to surrender. In fact, verse 10, the Assyrians said, why, God told us to come up here against this land and destroy it. Why, we're just doing what God wants us to do. On down in verse 13 of chapter 36, Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language. So here he is outside of Jerusalem, and he's making this announcement in Hebrew because he wants all the people who, are crowded around the wall. They're all up there, they're all ears trying to find out what's going on. He makes an announcement. He says, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. He shall not be able to deliver you. Neither let Hezekiah make you trust in the eternal, saying, the Lord will deliver us. This city shall not be delivered into the hand of the king of Assyria. Don't trust that, he said. Why, don't listen to Hezekiah. Verse 16, notice. Hearken not to Hezekiah, thus says the king of Assyria, make an agreement with me by a present, and come out to me, and eat you every one of his vine and every one of his fig tree. Drink you every one of the waters of his own cistern. See, all the people from around the surrounding area had crowded into the walls of Jerusalem. The Assyrians said, look, there's no reason for you to be in this shape. Why, we're concerned, we Germans are very concerned about you Jews, and we want you to come out. And, you can enjoy the good things. Verse 17, until I come and take you away into a land like your own. A land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. We have these nice, this nice convoy. We're going to transport you. We've got a nice place in mind, nice places. Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau. You Jews, we've got this nice place we're going to transport you to, and you just come on out and just surrender to us, and we'll take care of you. We've got this nice place that we're sending you. Well, what do you think the effect of this was on the population in Jerusalem? The Assyrians have moved closer and closer. They poured into Judah from Israel, having conquered Israel and deported the population. Now they've come into Judah. Don't you think people started praying about it when they invaded the land? And quickly, just one after another, the defense cities of Judah began to fall. There was no standing against them. Then they came up to Jerusalem. They had Jerusalem surrounded. The people had crowded in. And the Assyrians are making all these nice-sounding promises, and they said, Hezekiah cannot deliver you. Why would you trust in him? Chapter 37, verse 1, came to pass when King Hezekiah heard it, he rent his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and he went into the house of the Lord. And so Hezekiah sent word to Isaiah the prophet, and Hezekiah received a letter, as it describes here on in the chapter. And verse 14 of chapter 37, Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers, and he read it. And Hezekiah went up into the house of the Lord, and he spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed unto the Lord, saying, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel that dwell between the cherubim, you are the God, even you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You've made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he sent to reproach the living God. He says, of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their countries. They've cast their gods into the fire, which are no gods, but the work of men's hands. Wood and stone. Therefore they've destroyed them. Now therefore, O eternal, our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the eternal, even you only. So Hezekiah poured out his prayer to God. Now let's just stop right there and let's skip on down to chapter 38. We'll come back and pick up the rest of it. Have you ever noticed how sometimes when you're going through trials and problems, it seems like everything happens at once? You got one problem, then another one. Then, it's like it's all going on at the same time. Hezekiah sort of felt like that about this time, because notice chapter 38, verse 1. In those days was Hezekiah sick unto death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, came to him and said unto him, thus says the Eternal, set your house in order, for you're going to die and not live. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to God. And he began to really cry out to God, and so God sent Isaiah back, verse 5, go and say to Hezekiah, thus says the Eternal, the God of David your father, I've heard your prayer, I've seen your tears. Behold, I will add unto your days 15 years, and I will deliver you and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and I'll defend this city. You see, Hezekiah was sick right at the time when the city was surrounded. You think maybe that was a discouraging time? If you're going to look at it from a human standpoint, things were going from bad to worse. The Assyrians had invaded. Hezekiah didn't wait till he got to Jerusalem to start praying. You can bet he was praying when he knew they were heading that direction. And he prayed about it and undoubtedly fasted about it, and people talked, and the Assyrians kept coming. And one city after another fell, and pretty soon they had arrived at Jerusalem. They surrounded the city of Jerusalem, and they were sending in all these ultimatums and discouraging the people and trying to say, look, there's no way you can get out of this, you better just surrender to us. And about that time, the next day, Hezekiah went in, spread the letter out before God, besought God with his whole heart. He got up the next day and he didn't feel too good. And he got feeling a little worse and finally went to bed. Isaiah the prophet came and he said, God's given me a message, and the message is you're about to die. Better get your affairs in order. Boy, the city is surrounded, the whole nation's about to be swallowed up, now he gets sick and is about to die. And he besought God. And God said, all right. As Hezekiah really turned to God, recognizing that God is the only deliverer. God sometimes allows things to get to this point so that we might really fully understand that God is the one who does the delivering. So God says, I'm going to heal you, and I'm going to deliver the city out of the hand of the Assyrians. Verse 7, and this is going to be a sign unto you from the Lord, that the Lord will do this thing that He's spoken. Behold, I will bring again the shadow of the degrees which is gone down by the sundial of Ahaz, 10 degrees backward. So the sun returned 10 degrees, by which degrees it was gone down. Now wait a minute. You think about this. God says, I'm going to give you a sign. I'm going to heal you and I'm going to deliver the city. And I want you to know that I'm going to do that. I'm going to give you a sign that I'm going to do it. So the sign occurred before God did it. God does things in His own time. But He said, the sun's going to go backward. That sundial you got set up out there, you're going to see that the shadow is going to retreat 10 degrees. And you think, well, how can the sun go backward across the sky? Well, it's pretty simple. If you're God, God's the one that put it up there to begin with. He's the one that designed the earth, designed all the rotational patterns. He's the one that set them into motion. That wasn't any hard problem for God. But I guarantee you the Assyrians must have set up and took notice, sort of wondered what was happening. The sun's heading the wrong direction. You think maybe they got just a tad nervous around that time? Because they'd been boasting about how, God of Israel couldn't defeat them. In fact, what we find in verse 36 of Isaiah 37, or let's pick it up in verse 35 of Isaiah 37. This is what God told Hezekiah. He said, I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Then the angel of the Eternal went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. Now, it wasn't the Assyrians that got up and found out they were dead. It was the Israelites that arose and saw that, what happened to the Assyrians. Verse 37, so Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. You better believe he departed and went and returned. He did all of it, and he did it in a hurry. Can you imagine, here's the king, he's asleep here that night, and God's angel comes through. Was God intimidated because the army was big? How many angels did he have to send? Well, according to this, he only sent one. God's got legions of angels, but one angel was well able to take care of 185,000 Assyrians. King got up the next morning, rubbed his eyes and sat up and must have looked around and wondered where his servant was. Fellows bring him his, his robe or his morning coffee or his sandals or whatever he was looking for, and the servant wasn't there. Boy, you can imagine, he was getting mad about this time, wondering where is that, lazy guy, I'm going to get him. And so he hollered for him a time or two, and nobody came. By this time, he was really getting steamed. Got up and went out of the, opened up the tent door, and there, right at the door of the tent, here was the soldier supposed to be guarding him. Here he was laying dead. Well, that wouldn't have set too well. And about that time, he looked out, and the next one was dead, and the next one was dead. He started looking around. There were 185,000 dead men. He was in the middle of a graveyard, and he was the only one that, only all the corpses weren't buried. He was the only thing alive. And it says the king of Assyria departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. You better believe he grabbed the first fast horse he could find, hopped on him and took off and didn't let his shirt tail touch his back until he got home. He didn't know exactly what happened, but he didn't want to wait around to see what had gotten the rest of them. And he wasn't too smart, because when he came back, verse 38, he went to worship in the house of Nisroch, his god. Now, he should have figured out that his god wasn't much, because he hadn't done him much good back there, but he went into the house of his god, and his sons assassinated him. Nice family. See, God took care of delivering Jerusalem. He healed Hezekiah. God is our deliverer. God delivered Hezekiah, delivered his people during that time, the Assyrians coming down on them. Yet God delivered. God took care of it. The events that we go through and that we are, that stand ahead of us in the years ahead are not things that we have to be frightened of. They're not things that we have to be scared of. We're told in in Psalm chapter 90, verse 1, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever had been, or ever formed the earth, the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you're God. You turn man to destruction and say, return, you children of men. You see, God is our deliverer. Chapter 91, verse 1 talks about, he that dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. God's our refuge. You read the book of Zephaniah, the very word Zephaniah means the hidden of the eternal. God talks about dwelling in the secret place of the Most High, being protected. God is our deliverer, he's our protector. But you know what happens? People get their eyes off of God and they get their eyes on the men. They see all the problems, all the difficulties. Satan would like to get our attention diverted and off into all sorts of things to undermine faith. Even when Jesus Christ walked the earth as a human being, was doing the work of God in a very personal sense, preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God straight from his own mouth. There were all sorts of people that became offended at him and lost faith in him as the Messiah. While he was here, he said things and did things, and, that bothered some folks. And we find over and over the statement about how certain ones were offended at it. And they, he told the Jews that believed on him, you can read in John chapter 8, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed. And you read on down a little bit later, and you find out many of those who claimed to believe in him, they became offended, they went off, and they departed. I remember a number of years ago, this was back in 1974, and I had just come to Corpus Christi as the new minister. There were problems that were transpiring in the church at that time, events that had gone on. The previous minister there had left and had spread a lot of rumors and a lot of gossip about things, and one of the things had to do with the things in Pasadena, and he mentioned about a certain individual who was involved with the finances of the church at that time, who has long since been gone, but was involved in a very prominent role at that time, and he was suspicious of this fellow and what he was up to and what he was doing, and he was really bothered about that, and he had all these questions about tithing. And so we went through the Scriptures, and I went through various verses about what God said, and finally, I could see that he was still bothered by it, and that didn't satisfy him. And I said, well, let me ask you something. Thought I'd try a different tack. I said, what if you had lived back in the days of the first century? What if you could have walked up personally to Jesus Christ and handed Him personally your tithe? Would you be satisfied with that? Oh, well, yeah, that'd be different. But he didn't trust this other fellow. I said, well, let me ask you something else. What do you think Jesus Christ of Nazareth would have done with it if you had handed it to him? I don't know. He didn't seem to know what I was driving at. I said, well, I can tell you exactly what he would have done. In fact, we read of it right here in John chapter 12. We read of Mary in John chapter 12, verse 3, taking a pound of the ointment of spikenard, very costly, and she anointed the feet of Jesus. In verse 4 of John 12, one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, said, why wasn't this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? So the first thing Judas started doing was griping about the way that money was being spent, saying this is extravagant and this shouldn't have been done. Now, notice what it says next in verse 6. This he said, not because he cared for the poor. It wasn't that Judas was just this compassionate fellow. He didn't say this because he cared for the poor. He said it because he was a thief. And he had the bag, and he bore what was put therein. I said to this fellow, I said, you know what Jesus would have done? If you'd have walked up and handed him your tithe, your offering. He'd have turned around and given it to Judas. Judas was the keeper of the bag. He'd have given it to Judas, and Judas would have put it in the bag. You know what Judas would have done? As soon as he got opportunity, he'd have stolen some of it. I said, what would this have proven to you? If you had found that out, would that prove to you Jesus of Nazareth can't be the Messiah? I'm certainly not going to follow him anymore. He's got this guy over here that's a crook. Old Judas. You think Jesus didn't know what Judas was up to? You think he was shocked and couldn't figure it out? No, he knew. He looked at the woman at the well in Samaria. He asked her where her husband was, and she said, well, I'm not married. And he says, you're right. You've been married 5 times, and the guy you're living with isn't your husband. You hadn't gotten around to marrying him yet, have you? He could look right into the hearts and minds of people. He knew. You see, the point was those who got their eyes off of the work that Jesus Christ was doing and off of the message that he was preaching found fault. Because things they didn't understand. Why this is being allowed, why that's happening, and why this problem, why that difficulty. God has a plan and a purpose that he's working out. Judas fit into God's plan. The part he played wasn't a very good part. But that was prophesied in the Old Testament too. You see, the point is there were many who became offended with Jesus Christ. They became offended with him because they got their eyes off of God. They got their eyes off of the message, off of the truth that he was proclaiming and the work that he was doing. And things didn't quite suit them. They saw things and they got confused, they got bothered. Let me tell you something, brethren. The times we're going to live through in the years ahead of us, our faith is going to be assaulted from all directions. Jesus said, when the Son of Man returns, shall he find faith on the earth? The just shall live by faith. How are we going to live through the times ahead of us as these events begin to rise in Europe? We're going to have to know our God. We're going to have to walk with God. God's got to be real to us. Because when we're walking with God and we're close to God and we're really walking in faith with God, having the confidence that God is our protector, he's our deliverer, we don't have to become frightened and try to protect ourselves. Our self-protective strategies are destined to failure. When we put things in God's hands and we trust him and we walk with him, there's an absolute confidence that we can have. Because it's the Most High God that possessor of heaven and earth that you and I serve. It's the God of greatness and glory and power. The same God that delivered Hezekiah can deliver you and me. As we see the events of this world shaping up and fitting into the configuration that the prophecies of the Bible talk about, we don't have to face those years ahead of us with dread and fear and apprehension. Yes, there are going to be terrible things that occur. But we have a Father in heaven that loves us and that tells us He's the one that's there to take care of us. But we're going to have to walk in faith. We're going to have to trust Him even when all the events around us seem to testify otherwise. You know, if Hezekiah had simply looked at the mess he was in, he could have given up on God and said, well, you know, what's the use? All the other cities have fallen, Jerusalem surrounded by a vast army, and I'm about to die. Did that put God in a bind? No. That wasn't any problem. God could send the God that Hezekiah prayed to was the God that could send the sun backward 10 degrees. That's how powerful He was. God wasn't intimidated by the size of the army. God's not intimidated by the size of the mountain, by the problems that are ahead of us. We've been called as a part of the first fruits of God's plan. We have a job and a work set before us. We've got to go forward step by step, day by day, leaning on God, trusting God, depending on God, seeking God with our whole heart. And brethren, we can do so in confidence and in faith. How are we going to make it? The just shall live by faith.